Hey guys, tonight we're about to step into the smouldering nightmare that will bury the entire Tudor dynasty. At just 9 years old, Edward was handed the crown, but instead of childhood games, the boy was raised on divine right theory and religious fanaticism, only to carry out death sentences with the ruthless precision of a tyrant. Picture this, a candlelit palace where the anguished screams of the condemned echo through the halls. A scene so chilling that even the formidable Henry VIII would shudder. You won't survive this story if you just skim through it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your local time zone. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Edward VI was born in 1537, amid cheers that rang through the entire palace. After so many years of turbulent succession, Henry VIII had finally secured a legitimate son, an outburst of joy, yet only 12 days later, Jane Seymour, Queen and Edward's birth mother, slipped into a coma from which she would never awaken, leaving the boy stranded within the cold corridors of the royal court. From the very first moments, Edward VI never tasted the peaceful simplicities of childhood. Rather than laughter and playful games, he knew only the awed gazes and exultant praise from all around. Every step he took pressed into the scarlet carpet. Every word he spoke was recorded by watchful ladies in waiting. That splendor, however magnificent, grew stifling. He never smelled fresh grass, never called out friends to the other palace children, but only understood the sound of applause and the toll of ceremonial bells. Unlike his elder sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had endured their father's wrath, Edward VI knew only adulation. Henry VIII, perhaps to atone for the harshness shown to his daughters, poured all his devotion into his only son. That love, though deep, invisibly confined the boy within a golden cage of royal favour, causing him to lose simple emotions, fear of the dark or excitement at a new toy one by one. From the very first dawn, Edward VI was clad in silken robes, fitted with a tiny crown, and placed upon an imaginary throne in the heart of the vast palace. With no peers to turn to, he would gaze at his reflection in the tall windows and wonder whether he was an ancient child or a future king. The lavish garments and solemn ceremonies only underscored the gulf between him and the outside world, emphasizing that Edward was not an ordinary boy but the embodiment of a sacred destiny. The burden of a nation-saving mission weighed heavier than any masterpiece. He was reminded again and again that he alone shone as England's beacon, its talisman against every peril. The admiring eyes of courtiers, soldiers, and even the royal lineage fixed upon him, pressing an unnamed weight upon his tender heart. At night, when the palace slipped into darkness and the harp's melody faded away, Edward VI lay alone on his silk bed, hearing his own ragged breaths echo through the vast chamber. That marked the beginning of a tragic journey. An innocent boy's heartbeats were gradually silenced, replaced by loneliness and a thirst for power. From that moment, the cradle of authority did more than nurture it, imprisoned Edward VI's fragile soul in the swirl of fate, foreshadowing the thorny path he would be forced to tread. From the instant he turned 9, Edward had access to a special kind of schooling, handpicked by his father, Henry VIII. It was not the varied, nourishing curriculum one might expect for a growing boy, but a relentless regimen steeped in ideology. Latin and Greek served merely as elegant facades, for lessons on divine right and the supremacy of the new Protestant faith. John Chake, Edward's chief tutor, was far more than a scholar of letters. He was a fervent theologian who filled the young prince's mind with stern proclamations about the crimes of the Catholic Church and the unassailable authority of the monarch. History, philosophy, even the art of governance were all refracted through the lens of anti-Catholic fervour, teaching Edward from his earliest days that any resistance to the Church equalled defiance of God himself. This blood-tinged education, delivered with almost militaristic precision, became the first tool that shaped Edward's burgeoning authoritarian spirit. By the time he was 8, he could recite complex theological arguments to justify the eradication of Catholic sinners in defense of spiritual purity. The chilling truth was that while his intellect was sharpened like a blade, his capacity for friendship and empathy remained dormant. He spent his days surrounded by deferential adults, noblemen in velvet robes, ladies-in-waiting in silken gowns who praised every syllable he spoke and documented every gesture he made. There was no laughter exchanged with peers, no whispered secrets shared under a leafy bower, only the hollow echo of applause and the solemn tolling of chapel bells. This peculiar mixture of advanced study and emotional isolation set the stage for a future unlike any other. Edward's mind grew keen, remembering every passage and argument taught to him, yet his heart remained locked behind gilded bars. He knew the weight of power before he knew the comfort of a friend's embrace. Simple childhood delights, chasing butterflies, splashing through puddles after rain, were replaced by the cold pleasures of ideological victory. The boy who ought to have been coaxed to giggle in the nursery was instead trained to deliver stern lectures on scriptural law, his every word measured for doctrinal accuracy. In this crucible of rigid doctrine and royal favour, Edward's character took shape as something altogether more formidable than mere youth. The same cradle that nourished his mind also encaged his spirit, urging him toward a singular, unyielding purpose to wield absolute authority in the name of God and crown. A throne of ivory and gold, promising comfort and reverence, became the very prison that forged his resolve. Each day's lessons drew him deeper into a world where mercy was weakness and dissent was sacrilege. And so, the seeds of a tyrant were sown in someone too young to comprehend the full weight of his actions. Edward's intellect and ambition, honed by relentless indoctrination, would one day outpace the compassion of those who surrounded him. In the hush of candlelit chambers, with quill in hand and Latin texts open before him, the boy king absorbed every doctrine and decree, unaware that the very education meant to empower him would also bind his heart in ice. The result was a mind as sharp as any blade, paired with a soul unnaturally chilled twin forces that would come to define his short but indelible reign. This was the solemn beginning of Edward's transformation, a journey from innocent child to a ruler whose understanding of power eclipsed his capacity for empathy. In the echo of every lecture and the hush of every chapel hymn, the young king's destiny took shape, an existence suspended between scholarly rigour and emotional exile, foreshadowing the shadowy path he was destined to tread. In the autumn of 1547, when Henry VIII breathed his last, the crown of England settled upon the tender head of Edward VI, barely 9 years old. Under the stewardship of a regency council led by the Duke of Somerset, many whispered hopes of moderation and reconciliation among warring religious factions. Yet, within the hushed halls of the Privy Chamber, young Edward's restless spirit soon betrayed those gentle expectations. In the first council meeting he attended, he rose from his gilded chair, as though to reclaim a birthright, interrupting seasoned statesmen with the fervour of a preacher. With solemn eyes and measured tone, he lectured on the purity of the Reformed faith, chiding any soul who dared suggest compromise with Rome. His voice, though childlike, carried the weight of unshakable conviction, and those gathered fell silent, shivering as if in a sudden chill. By candlelight, Edward would pore over dusty tomes of Protestant theology before the council assembled each morning. He pressed his small hand upon the lectern and spoke of divine mandate, declaring that any tolerance of Catholic rites was tantamount to defying God's own will. His arguments, drawn from Scripture and bolstered by the zeal of his tutors, carried a confidence that startled the oldest nobles. Some remembered their own fathers' gentler reigns, others the brutality of previous persecutions, but none could recall hearing such untempered resolve from one so young. The court took note. A boy king, 16 years younger than most rulers of old, now embodied the very essence of unyielding authority. Just weeks after the solemn anointing in Westminster Abbey, Edward claimed yet more power. He insisted upon sitting in on legal proceedings, his tiny hand stamping decrees alongside the Great Seal. The court records of that first month are chilling to read. They show his signature granting permission for capital sentences against those branded heretics. Witnesses spoke in trembling tones of seeing the prince smile as he pressed the wax seal into parchment, green candlelight flickering across his pale cheeks. When an advisor dared suggest a more lenient punishment for a repentant Catholic lord, Edward flew into what courtiers would later call a religious tantrum. Clenching his fists, he hurled his inkpot across the table, watching in grim satisfaction as dark ink splattered upon robes and panelling. "Mercy is betrayal," he cried, his voice echoing against the stone walls. That moment marked a turning point. The gleeful scholar of sylvan tales and dreaming boy vanished, replaced by a sovereign who knew no restraint. Within days, the boy king's personal register grew thick, with names of those condemned for practicing forbidden rites. Each night, Edward would retire to his chamber, where the muffled cries of the condemned drifted through the corridors like a morbid lullaby. In his bed of silk and velvet, he listened, eyes half closed, almost lulled by the rhythm of suffering and authority, intertwined. The solitude of his youth, so lavishly adorned, yet utterly isolated, deepened his reliance on power as the sole companion he could trust. Throughout the cold winter that followed, Edward's court transformed into an arena of fear and awe. The Duke of Somerset and other regents murmured behind carved screens, questioning the prudence of such severity. They wondered if the child king could be guided back to gentler ways, yet feared to contradict his divine proclamations. For Edward himself, each harsh decree seemed but a small sacrifice toward his grand vision of a wholly purified realm. In his mind, the weight of the crown was as natural as his own breath, each act of judgment a testament to his ordained purpose. And so, the autumn of 1547 set in motion, a reign unlike any England had known a boy sovereign. Scarcely more than a child, wielding life and death authority with icy determination. Sleep, that most human of comforts, became ever more elusive for Edward, as the boundaries between dream and command blurred in his restless nights. The path he carved through inkpot and seal, through chamber and scaffold, would forever stain the memory of a monarchy once said to define moderation and mercy. In those early weeks, the boy king's ambitions were no longer whispered prophecies but resounding proclamations, a sovereign shaped by solitude and conviction, stepping boldly into a destiny both terrible and unforgettable. Edward VI was not merely a scholar of harsh doctrines, he was enamored with the grim mechanics of torture itself. In the hushed corridors of the palace, servants would sometimes stumble upon his private sketches, meticulous diagrams of iron pincers, serrated knives, slender whips and weighted chains, each annotated with notes on their efficacy in extracting confession or ensuring obedience. Rather than gallop across palace grounds or indulge in the exuberant games of youth, Edward devoted his afternoons to poring over frost-cold treatises on the Spanish Inquisition and transcriptions of brutal interrogations. His fascination was not viewed as eccentric but rather celebrated, as proof that he was the divine instrument ordained to crush heresy. By lamplight, the boy, king's chamber, transformed into a quiet laboratory of cruelty. The hush was punctuated only by the soft rustle of parchment and the occasional drip of melting candle wax. He would trace his finger along the curves of drawn blades, envisioning their sharpness against pliant flesh. A corrupt joy flickered behind his sleepy gaze, as if each diagram whispered to him a promise of absolute power. To his mind, these implements were not grotesque curiosities, but sacred tools, ordained by Providence to preserve the realm's purity. Outside his chamber, the palace bustled with life lutes strummed. Footsteps pattered across marble floors, and courtiers exchanged courteous greetings. Within the grand tapestry of courtly rituals, Edward's private passion stood apart like a solitary moth drawn to a funeral pyre. His tutors, impressed by his zeal, encouraged this morbid study as evidence of divine favour. After all, was not a monarch's duty to defend true faith by any means necessary? Thus the boy king became both judge and executioner. In theory, his imagination fueled by shadowy manuscripts rather than childhood rhymes. Edward's cruelty extended beyond parchment. One afternoon, a young page accidentally spilled a goblet of red wine across the prince's important dispatches. Edward's sleepy eyes narrowed, and he issued a command that chilled the servants to their bones. The page was dragged to the central courtyard and ordered to remain standing as guards and eunuchs hurled handfuls of rotten fruit, stale bread, and festering scraps at him for hours on end. All the while, Edward reclined on a velvet divan, his posture languid, his gaze half-lidded, as if observing a curious insect under glass. He recorded every shudder, every quiver of the page's limbs, as though conducting a clinical experiment. In his journals, Edward noted the effectiveness of each throw, the stench of spoiled grapes, the splatter of curdled milk, the bruise-forming force of crusted rolls. He jotted down margins of crude sketches showing trajectories and angles, as though mapping the geometry of humiliation. Mercy, in his young mind, had become a betrayal of his sacred duty. The notion of compassion seemed to weaken the very sinews of authority he sought to wield, and so he banished it entirely from his palette of governance. Night after night, Edward lay awake, cocooned in silk sheets, his ears tuned to distant echoes of despair drifting through the palace corridors. In the gloom, he would drift into a drowsy reverie, picturing future audiences in which he might decree harsher penances, prouder proclamations, and sterner rebukes. The lullaby of suffering lulled him closer to sleep, a paradoxical comfort born of power and isolation. His dreams, if they came, were populated not by playful friends or pastoral scenes, but by the clang of chains and the glint of iron instruments under torchlight. Meanwhile, the Queen Dowager and councillors exchanged worried glances behind ornate screens. They had hoped this boy king might grow into a balanced ruler, guided by moderation and mercy. Instead, they witnessed the blossoming of a solitary figure whose delight in domination overshadowed any vestige of childhood. Somerset himself dared not reproach Edward's cruel experiments, fearing that to challenge the prince's curiosity was to question the very will of God, and so the council remained silent, their counsel muffled under the weight of divine right and princely temper. As winter's frost crept across the palace gardens, Edward's fascination only deepened. He acquired new volumes on medieval torture chambers, translated from obscure Latin manuscripts. He ordered craftsmen to forge miniature replicas of rack components and iron cages, arranging them in a private gallery that he viewed with sombre pride. His attendants whispered that the display was like a children's toy collection, except each item symbolized pain and power rather than whimsy. By early spring, the visitors to the court learned to tread carefully around the prince's quarters. A faint scent of oil and iron lingered in the air, and the floors bore stray flecks of ink and wax. Edward's gaze, when it met theirs, was both languid and piercing, as if he were searching for a spark of defiance to snuff out. The palace, once a place of celebration and gentle music, had become a theatre of dread, with the boy king as its sole actor and audience. Thus unfolded Edward's descent into a darkness rarely seen in so young a sovereign. His nights were haunted by the restless dance of flame against steel, and his days consumed by the study of instruments of torment. Each scratch of quill upon paper, each suppressed yelp in the courtyard, bound him tighter to a destiny of tyranny. The boy who should have known simple joys instead embraced the sombre artistry of cruelty, forging a legacy that would chill England's memory for generations to come. At just 10 years old, Edward VI took quill to parchment and crafted sermons that echoed across England, calling for the total eradication of Catholic influence and vowing to defend the true faith at any cost. His words, delivered with a solemn gravity beyond his years, urged every parish to root out heresy, as though it were a creeping rot. In hushed villages and bustling towns alike, banners bearing his decrees hung in churchyards, and the air trembled with the promise of divine retribution. It was as if the boy king himself whispered in every ear, compromise was a betrayal of God, and only unwavering obedience could preserve souls from eternal damnation. To enforce his vision, Edward established a vast network of religious surveillance that cast a pall of fear over the realm. Neighbours were urged to denounce each other at the first sign of forbidden prayer. Children received small rewards for reporting their own parents' hidden devotions. Court-issued proclamations spelled out punishments for any deviation from approved rites, from public humiliation in the market square to confinement in dank dungeons. And in the gravest cases, execution by the block. No corner of daily life escaped scrutiny. The simplest act of lighting an unsanctioned candle or murmuring an old prayer could land one before the boy king's tribunal. Yet Edward did not merely delegate this grim task, he presided over each accusation himself. Gathered around the high table in the council chamber, he would review affidavits and depositions, his youthful hand guiding the feathered tip of the quill as he inscribed verdicts and new penalties. If an initial sentence struck him as insufficiently severe, he would cross it out and replace it with harsher words. Mercy, in Edward's mind, had no place in the defence of orthodoxy. Leniency invited weakness, and weakness threatened the very foundation of the realm's salvation. In the first high-profile purge of the winter of 1548, dozens of Catholic nobles were swept up in a whirlwind of arrests and trials, conducted with breathtaking speed. The Great Hall, normally a place of ceremonial pomp, became an echo chamber for sombre proclamations of guilt. Each defendant was granted only a perfunctory hearing before Edward, robed in velvet and ermine, signed off on their fates. The clang of the block and the hush of stairs that followed echoed through the corridors, a grim symphony of obedience and dread. Edward, for his part, viewed the proceedings with clinical detachment. He tapped the great seal into crimson wax, smiling faintly as it left its mark. Then, turning to the council, he distributed small tokens, coins and ribbons to the most zealous informers, praising their vigilance as though they had won medals in service to the crown. The rewards, though modest, fueled a frenzy of mutual suspicion. Neighbours eyed one another with cold calculation, wondering who would be next to earn the boy king's favour. Every facet of religious and political life was now wrapped in the new doctrine, and deviation was equated with treason. A shepherd who led a secret mass, a teacher who quoted an old psalm, even a merchant who hung a crucifix in his stall, all found themselves accused of crimes against crown and creed. The machinery of persecution ground forward relentlessly, its gears oiled by children's whispers and neighbourly grudges. Where once laughter and song had drifted across the fields, now only the hush of fear reigned. Thus did the realm awaken to a nightmare born of a child's hand. The terror that Edward summoned began as a trickle of rumours and accusations, but rapidly became a flood that threatened to drown England in its own zeal. Sleep grew elusive for many, as the night brought whispers of hidden arrests, and the distant toll of chapel bells repurposed to call the faithful to confession or to the scaffold. In those dark days, the boy king's name was spoken in trembling tones, a reminder that even innocence, when forged in isolation and driven by unwavering conviction, can become the deadliest instrument of all. When he turned 11 years old, Edward VI revealed a will both singular and unyielding to secure absolute authority beyond anyone's challenge. Under his direct command, the religious surveillance network grew more intricate than ever before. Every murmur of unapproved devotion, no matter how faint, was dutifully logged by trembling scribes and dispatched to the Lord Supreme himself for final sanction. In candlelit anterooms, officers whispered of lists that stretched endlessly, each name a thread in the tapestry of divine oversight. The soft click of quills and the rustle of parchment became the new heartbeat of a realm perched on the brink of ceaseless scrutiny. Villagers found themselves living in constant trepidation. Local magistrates, now flush with royal favour, conducted sudden inspections without warning, herding entire hamlets into open courtyards for compulsory rituals. Citizens bowed beneath the chill autumn sky, arms raised in a rigid salute of obedience, while record keepers noted every bowed head and crooked gesture. Those who faltered, whether in posture, voice, or timing, were marked for censure, their names inked in official ledgers, destined for the prince's own review. Even the wind seemed to carry the echo of clipped instructions. A low, ceaseless whisper, reminding all that to breathe outside the strict script was to invite peril. Edward himself often presided over these public trials, donning robes of velvet and ermine that made him appear as both judge and sovereign deity. He would step forward, eyes half-lidded with a dreamy detachment, to read aloud the formal charges before the gathered crowd. His small hand, poised with a silver stylus, would confirm each sentence: death for unrepentant heretics, imprisonment for the wavering soul, and public shaming for any who dared waver. No longer was he the hesitant child of recent memory. He wielded every royal prerogative as though born clutching the sceptre itself, transforming the court into a stage where despair and obedience danced in unison under his command. Court historians later recorded with wide-eyed detail how Edward rewarded the youngest informants with tokens of approval, pieces of silver and bright ribbons, to encourage further denunciations. Children, once free to scamper in fields, now patrolled hearths, ears attuned for whispered prayers or clandestine masses. A boy might peer through a crack in a cottage door and earn favour by reporting a father's hushed invocation. In turn, families trembled under the weight of suspicion, uncertain if their own offspring would become the instruments of their undoing. Thus, the innocence of youth was repurposed into a weapon of fear, forging a climate where even mothers dared not hum a familiar hymn lest they draw the scrutiny of tiny, watchful eyes. Inside the palace, insiders whispered how Edward drafted exhaustive regulations, dictating every nuance of worship. He specified the proper folds of church vestments, the precise length of genuflection at the altar, even the volume and cadence of prayers. Pages in his elegant script outlined that a whispered prayer falling short of 3 measured seconds was tantamount to blasphemy. These dogmatic minutiae were published in official manuals distributed to every parish. A single misstep, a too loud amen, or a too soft petition could be cited as evidence of rebellion. Such obsessive detail turned faith into a minefield, where the faithful navigated each rite with trembling care. In just a few short months, England itself was reshaped into a great carceral expanse, from the grandest cathedral down to the humblest hearth. Room for individuality or private thought had vanished beneath the shadow of Edward's true faith. Freedom of conscience was erased, replaced by the omnipresent gaze of church wardens and constables, enforcing each decreed liturgy. To light an unauthorized candle became a capital offense. To sing an old psalm without permission merited public censure. The realm, once a tapestry of varied devotion, now presented a monochrome portrait of fear, starkly illuminated by royal edict and the boy, king's unwavering resolve. Even those who had once championed the Regency Council found themselves bending the knee before Edward's youthful will. Somerset and his fellow regents, who had harboured hopes of a temperate governance, now softened their dissent behind carved screens. For to oppose the child king was to challenge what they dared call his divine mandate. Every whispered objection carried the weight of sacrilege, and even the faintest protest threatened swift reprisal. Thus the council's guiding hand faltered beneath the swell of princely determination, leaving Edward's edicts to stand unchallenged, a testament to the power of untempered youth. And so, as the winter chill settled over England's fields and villages, the world Edward crafted stood in austere relief, a land where every glance, every breath, was subject to the scrutiny of a boy king's ever-hungry gaze. In such a realm, the notion of mercy became a fragile dream, and the pulse of fear beat steady beneath the frost-laden skies. The boy who had once played in gilded gardens had grown into an architect of despair, proving that absolute power, once firmly grasped, could turn even the purest of souls into agents of unyielding repression. Edward's cruelty extended far beyond the common folk. It reached into the very heart of his own blood. His two elder sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, each once battered by their father's temper, now gazed upon a brother who seemed a stranger to familial warmth. In Edward's eyes, Mary embodied the perilous threat of Catholic resurgence, a living symbol of defiance against his cherished Reformation. Elizabeth, by contrast, existed merely as a bargaining chip, a future bride to cement alliances with Protestant courts on the continent. Not once did Edward offer a gentle word or brotherly embrace. Instead, he repeatedly issued orders, confining them to secluded quarters, curtailing their contact with the outside world and stripping away every shred of autonomy they once possessed. When Thomas Seymour, Edward's own uncle, attempted to win the boy's affection through tokens of kindness and whispered counsel, the prince recoiled in icy disdain. Seymour's gentle overtures, intended to soften the court's tensions, were twisted by Edward into evidence of scheming at the prince's behest. Councillors drew up charges of treason and clapped the uncle in irons. Then, with a flick of his small hand, Edward affixed the seal to the warrant for execution, showing not an ounce of hesitation. Witnesses later recounted in hushed, trembling voices how the king watched from a nearby window as Seymour knelt beneath the block. The young monarch's gaze was clinical, his eyes tracing the arc of the descending axe. And afterward, he meticulously recorded the execution's details, how the blade bit into flesh, the exact angle of its fall, even the fleeting expressions of fear and resignation that crossed his uncle's face. Such detached documentation horrified courtiers who had grown numb to Henry VIII's brutality. This was tyranny wielded by a child, unchecked even when applied to his own kin. Within the royal residence, family bonds were reshaped by doctrine and dominion. Mary was branded a traitor to God, coerced into confessing her alleged sins against the true faith. Her public admissions, dictated in Edward's own hand, were meant to shame her into submission. Elizabeth's fate was altogether different, spared execution, but denied any semblance of private life. She was kept under constant supervision, her every conversation monitored for signs of wavering loyalty. Meeting her brother required the presence of 2 or more guards who noted every word and gesture, ensuring that no spontaneous affection could bloom, even a flicker of emotional warmth, a shared smile. A gentle glance was interpreted as a breach of protocol, a momentary lapse in devotion to the crown's sacred mandate. Thus, in the prince's mind, family ties were no longer bonds of love, but logistical considerations, mere instruments in service of his grand design. Rarely did Edward permit a private audience with either sister, and when he did, the encounter was tightly controlled. Mary would enter, curtsy, trembling, and find her brother perched upon a cushioned throne-like seat, his posture stiff, his expression flat. He demanded she recite passages from the newly sanctioned catechism and answer pointed questions about her faith. Any hesitation, any flicker of doubt, would prompt a swift reprimand. Elizabeth's visits were even more constrained. She was instructed to remain silent unless spoken to and speak only in select phrases pre-approved by royal decree. In this environment, the very notion of sisterhood became a hollow echo, lost beneath the weight of divine right and doctrinal rigidity. Over candlelit dinners held in the vast hall where the family once dined together, Edward presided over Mary and Elizabeth as though they were supplicants rather than siblings. Silver platters of fine fare were carried in and taken away. But the only sustenance either sister received was the cold ration of obedience laid before them. Edward, leaning back in his seat, would watch them with a detached curiosity, observing how they fared under the twin pressures of familial humiliation and religious scrutiny. To him, their plight served as a cautionary tale. Even those closest by blood must bow to the inflexible demands of faith and crown, and so the royal household, once a sanctuary of shared history and mutual care, became a stage for power's cruelest performance. Mary, once a princess hoping for reconciliation, learned to mask her piety in shadows and cryptic verses. Elizabeth, whose gentle wit had charmed many, found her sharp mind dulled by the constant vigilance she endured. Edward, in turn, saw in their subdued forms evidence of his own triumph through isolation and fear. He had reshaped his family into perfect reflections of his uncompromising rule. Each whispered prayer Mary dared utter in the moonlit darkness, each fleeting tear Elizabeth dared shed, only reinforced the young king's conviction that love, mercy, and kinship must always yield to the absolute authority he so fervently upheld. In this bleak tableau, the royal line's future seemed less a continuation of Tudor tradition and more a testament to the corrosive power of dogma when entrusted to untempered youth. The bonds of shared ancestry and common memory had been severed, replaced by the twin pillars of fear and obedience. And as Edward VI gazed down from his lofty perch, the chill in his heart spoke more loudly than any decree he might issue. A chilling reminder that even the closest of bonds can be snapped when dominated by untamed ambition and unwavering conviction. As illness crept into Edward VI's frail frame, it did not quell his fervour. Instead, it drove him to ever more reckless ambition. Each shuddering breath seemed only to strengthen his resolve that England must never fall back under the sway of Rome. In the dim candlelight of late-night councils, he conferred in hushed tones with John Dudley, Earl of Northumberland, plotting to secure the throne for a Protestant heir. Their grand design centred on Lady Jane Grey, Edward's cousin, the daughter of both royal lines, who would take Mary's place after the young king's inevitable passing. In secret gatherings that stretched into the small hours, Edward meticulously outlined the steps of their upheaval. He and Dudley debated the charges to bring against Mary and Elizabeth accusations of treason, heresy, and secret collusion with foreign powers. He drafted indictments heavy with biblical quotations, branding any sympathy for Catholicism as an act of rebellion against God himself. Letters bearing these dark missives were sent through underground Protestant networks in London and the southeastern counties, priming sympathetic clergy for the coming coup. As their plans solidified, Edward hastened to assemble the lists of those to be arrested, tried, or exiled. He insisted on exacting every ounce of property owned by Catholic nobles to be redistributed among devoted Protestant lords. Each new land grant would come with a binding oath of allegiance to the young queen he envisioned, ensuring that loyalty to the Reformed Church and to the Grey successor would eclipse all other bonds. His scribbled notes included provisions for vesting ultimate authority in a council of staunch reformers, effectively cementing a government beholden only to his doctrinal vision. Even the realm's simplest folk were enlisted in his cause. Edward personally drafted leaflets urging commoners to rally for God's chosen to renounce anyone deemed a betrayer of the true faith. These handbills, printed in small batches by sympathetic presses, were distributed in market squares at dawn, fluttering in the crisp air as a clarion call to choose sides. The boy king, though weakened by fever, brimmed with excitement at the thought that his curtailed breath could still spark such a vast transformation. Night after night, he pored over these revolutionary manuals from his silken bed, fevered dreams of Protestant paradise, mingling with the cold reality of his failing strength. Each whispered strategy, each rustle of parchment, seemed to promise that his dying breath would not mark the end of his reign, but the birth of a new era. Even as his body weakened, his mind raced detailed protocols for rounding up recusants, guidelines for public sermons to stoke popular indignation, and ceremonial scripts for Jane Grey's coronation all were recorded in his shaky hand. Thus did Edward VI, on the brink of his final moments. Transform himself from child monarch into master architect of a radical plot. His anticipation pulsed through the palace, a final act of defiance against mortality and Catholic resurgence. He would not drift quietly into oblivion. Instead, he would cast England into the purifying fire of his unwavering conviction, no matter the cost to body, mind, or soul. In the final weeks of his life, Edward VI lay stricken by a relentless fever, his frail form racked by coughing fits that drew bright spurts of blood. Yet, even as delirium claimed him, he remained consumed by his grand designs. Between fits of delirious slumber, he would summon quills and parchment, drafting new statutes and framing incendiary propaganda. One moment he might call forth devout Protestant ministers for solemn prayers at his bedside. The next, he would lash out at them for not pursuing heretics with sufficient zeal. His handwriting, once precise and neat, now trembled violently, annotating every margin with chilling threats to execute hundreds, should the next reign prove lenient. Court physicians recorded the horrors of his decline in hushed medical journals. Terrible convulsions, skin turning a sickly blue-green symptoms. They attributed to arsenic poisoning from misguided medicinal tonics. They also noted his hallucinations. Edward claimed to see divine visions, God's own voice demanding the cleansing of every unbeliever. In lucid intervals, he would shout the names Mary and Elizabeth, his voice heavy with seething hatred, then pause to scrawl detailed instructions for their public interrogation. He envisioned dramatic trials staged before the masses, meant to terrify any who might consider defying the new order. Despite the ever-weakening beat of his heart, Edward never paused in his campaign of violence. He pressed on with unyielding determination to finalize the succession plan that would elevate Lady Jane Grey to the throne. His bedside became a clandestine office where he sealed decrees and conferred with John Dudley, Earl of Northumberland, instructing him to enact the charter the moment Edward's last breath slipped away. Each whispered meeting solidified. The coup names were crossed off lists of loyalists. The funds were set aside to bribe key nobles, and secret missives were ready to be dispatched at a moment's notice. Yet perhaps the most surreal moments came in the dead of night, when palace attendants recounted hearing Edward carry on conversations with the spirit of Lady Jane Grey herself, draped in spectral robes of melancholic devotion. He would beseech her ghost to carry on the torch of Protestantism, imploring her to shield the realm from the scourge of Catholic restoration. These arcane rites, performed by candlelight in silent chambers, spoke to the young king's frenzied need for assurance that his righteous vision would outlive his mortal frame. In those fragile hours, Edward's voice drifted through the halls in broken whispers and half-forgotten prayers. The child who had once pored over theological tomes for the sheer thrill of doctrinal debate now clung to every scrap of scripture as a lifeline. His feverish mind drew strength from the conviction that his suffering served a higher purpose, to secure England's spiritual purity at any cost. Yet even as each shuddering breath threatened to be his last, he remained unwilling to succumb to pity or retreat from his crusade. Palace corridors, once bustling with the chatter of courtiers and the clatter of daily routine, fell into uneasy silence as word spread of the boy king's final designs. Servants moved like shadows, uncertain whether to breathe too loudly or whisper too freely. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of unspoken dread. Edward's last acts would echo long after the candles in his chamber flickered out. Even those closest to him sensed that the fever that consumed his flesh mirrored the fire of his unquenchable ambition. On his final morning, Edward summoned his trusted counsellors to his bedside. With effort that drew gasps from onlookers, he signed the final documents, a charter transferring executive power to Northumberland, and a testament urging unwavering support for Jane Grey. His signature, a shaky scrawl upon the parchment, marked the culmination of a reign defined by doctrinal fervour and unrelenting severity. Then, with the council's solemn nod, the papers were secreted away, destined to ignite the Protestant coup he had laboured to orchestrate, even as death lurked at his door. Not long after, Edward's strength ebbed beyond recovery. In the hush of that great palace, his last laboured breath slipped away without fanfare. With it died the boy who had once dreamed of a purified realm, replaced by a legend of unwavering zealotry that would haunt England's memory for generations. Even in death, his final plot, born in fever and refined by fanaticism, stood as testament to the paradox of power wielded by one so young a heart once tender. Now, forever hardened by the chill of dogma and the weight of sovereignty. On the morning of the 6th of July, 1553, Edward VI drew his final, laboured breath. A profound stillness settled over the palace, as if the very walls paused to mourn the passing of a boy-king whose flame had burned so fiercely. Yet scarcely had the echoes of his last heartbeat faded before the fragile order he had forged began to unravel. John Dudley, Earl of Northumberland, entrusted with overseeing the transfer of power, moved with breath-stealing speed. Within 48 hours, Lady Jane Grey, Edward's cousin of noble Protestant lineage, was proclaimed Queen. In towns and villages, citizens woke to proclamations and banners bearing her name. Many were astonished, having expected Mary Tudor's succession. Meanwhile, Catholic lords, long subdued under Edward's merciless reign, rallied their levies and marshalled their forces in open defiance, determined to restore what they saw as the rightful heir. Yet the young regime proved as fleeting as morning mist. Before a full week passed, Jane's brief and ill-fated ascension crumbled. Her reign lasted scarcely half a day before the insurgent support for Mary of Tudor overwhelmed Northumberland's hastily arranged guard. Those who had sworn fealty to Edward and Jane found themselves hunted down with ruthless efficiency. Dozens were summarily tried and sentenced, some to the block, others to cold prison cells, among them prominent nobles, and even Northumberland himself. In the silent dawn following Jane's downfall, Mary Tudor, radiant with relief, claimed her crown as Mary I. She extended a conditional amnesty offering pardon to those who would renounce their support for the preceding coup, yet she did not spare the architects of Edward's cruelties. High-profile figures were executed or exiled, their fates a stern warning against the horrors of unchecked zeal. Edward VI's memory, though his reign was heartbreakingly brief, left scars indelible upon England's soul. In the aftermath of his fanatic rule, many who had once embraced the new Protestant order found themselves drawn back to the old Catholic traditions, seeking refuge from the whirlwind of doctrinal violence he had unleashed. The intricate web of informers and tribunals he had woven was painstakingly dismantled edge by edge, law by stringency, structure by structure, until the land sighed with newfound quiet. Yet the records of his executions, the chilling manifestos he penned, and the bones of his victims remained a sombre testament to the perversity of absolute power. His death did more than end a tragic life. It opened a new chapter in England's ongoing struggle between faith and authority. Posterity would learn that placing ultimate power in the hands of even the most fervent believer can warp the purest of intentions into a machinery of cruelty. Thus, generations would remember Edward VI as a cautionary echo when conviction becomes tyranny. The soul itself may turn to stone. Almost as soon as Mary I ascended the throne, she set about dismantling the brutal legacy her half-brother had left behind. In a flurry of proclamations, her newly convened council moved to repeal all of Edward's harsh heretic suppression acts, the very statutes he had crafted to root out Catholics. Yet Mary's mercy was not as simple as it seemed. Alongside the repeals, she restored the old Inquisition courts, summoning those who had signed death warrants under Edward to answer for their deeds. Night after night, prisoners were dragged before open-air tribunals in London's squares, and in the grey light of dawn, Dotzens noblemen, judges, even clergy were condemned as traitors to both crown and creed. By midday, The flames rose in palls of smoke, a grim reminder that Mary's justice could be as ruthless as the regime she replaced. For the watching crowds, the relief at Edward's end mingled with horror at this new wave of bloodshed. Baptized now under the banner of true Catholic faith. Throughout her first year, Mary concentrated on reviving the ancient rites of the Church. Latin once more filled cathedral aisles. Processions wound through town squares carrying statues of the Virgin Mary and painted icons long hidden away. Parishioners were compelled to kneel at communion rails every Sunday, reciting prayers in a language many did not understand. In remote hamlets, villagers whispered fears that they would be branded heretics if they failed to conform. Clutching well-worn New Testaments, they dared not open. The restoration of these venerable ceremonies, intended to heal the kingdom's religious wounds, instead deepened old divides. In northern counties, especially where Protestant sympathies had taken root, small uprisings broke out as farmers and weavers resisted the sudden imposition of unfamiliar rites. Their barns lit with candles against the dusk. They chanted in defiance, only to have royal troops arrive before dawn and quell their gatherings with steel and pikes. And so the woman, styled by some as the saviour of tradition, earned a new sobriquet, Bloody Mary, whispered behind barred chapel doors. The vengeance of her early reign taught both court and commoner a bitter lesson when the machinery of state is subservient only to religious zeal. Any faction, no matter how devout, can be twisted into an engine of cruelty. Mary believed herself the restorer of ancient piety, but in condemning those who had enforced Edward's brutal laws, she compounded the kingdom's collective grief. Fathers who had merely followed orders under duress were burned at stakes erected in village greens. Mothers who had mourned in secret saw their children taken into custody for cleansing. The flames that rose beneath foreign spies and Jesuit priests also consumed the names of innocent men, swept up in the tumult of power's shifting tides. By the time Mary's fourth autumn arrived, her hand had grown heavy with both sword and gavel. The very bones of the nation felt the weight of her reprisals. In the capital's graveyards, crosses marked the unmarked graves of those who had dared to lean toward reform men of learning, women of gentle faith, and children whose only crime was belonging to the wrong family. Yet those who survived the fires carried scars as surely as the charred remnants of their kin. A generation learned to speak in clipped tones of loyalty, hiding their true beliefs behind curt smiles, lest a sudden knock at the door deliver them to the next pyre. And so Mary's brief, storm-tossed reign, a mere 4 years, etched itself into history as one of England's darkest chapters. Her attempt to restore unity through Catholic ritual instead hurled the realm back into the arms of factional hatred. The slogan guiding her rule might have been Catholic England reborn. Yet what emerged was a land rent by fear and suspicion, where the simple act of prayer risked incineration. The lesson left to posterity was stark, place, unbounded religious authority in any single hand, and even the purest convictions may sour into a tyranny that spares no soul. However innocent, in royal chronicles and whispered tavern tales alike, Mary I's shadow loomed long after her death. The fires she lit to purify the realm burned away much more than the bodies of her enemies they consumed: trust, fellowship, and the fragile hope that once linked neighbour to neighbour. For the people of England, her legacy became a reminder that revenge, even in the name of faith, carries a price too dear: the slow erosion of humanity itself under the guise of sacred duty. Barely had Mary I claimed her crown when she moved, with sweeping purpose, to dismantle the reign of terror her half-brother had imposed. Her new Privy Council, convened in solemn haste, issued an edict annulling every article of Edward's infamous heretic suppression acts, those severe statutes that had empowered mobs to root out and slaughter Catholics. Yet Mary's reforms were no simple act of mercy. Alongside the repeal of her brother's laws, she resurrected the old Inquisition courts, those same tribunals through which medieval zealots had enforced doctrinal purity. Night after night, torchlit processions escorted former royal functionaries, jurists, and even august prelates into London's open squares. There, beneath grey dawn skies, these men and women accused of treason and heresy for having signed the death warrants of Edward's enemies were condemned. By noon, the square was surrounded by pallbearers and firewood, and by mid-afternoon, columns of black smoke billowed skyward as hundreds burned at the stake. For the citizens who watched these grim spectacles, relief at Edward's passing, mixed with a shiver of dread, a new wave of bloodshed had begun. Baptized now in the name of true Catholic faith, throughout her first year on the throne, Mary devoted herself to restoring the ancient splendor of Rome's liturgy. Latin psalms once again echoed through soaring vaults, gilded statues of the Virgin and painted icons, long hidden or destroyed during her brother's Protestant reforms, were solemnly returned to their shrines. Every Sunday, parishioners knelt at the communion rails, reciting prayers in a tongue many could scarcely follow. In remote villages, fear took root. Farmers and their families whispered anxiously that anyone failing to appear at Mass or neglecting the newly prescribed rites would be branded a heretic. Far to the north, where Edward's Protestant legacy had taken deeper hold, small uprisings flared as rural communities resisted these abrupt changes. Under the flicker of lanterns in that bitter first winter, they sang clandestine hymns of defiance in barns and churchyards. But before dawn, royal troops swept through, bayonets in hand, scattering the congregations and arresting their leaders. Thus did Mary, once hailed as a peaceful restorer of tradition, earn the grim sobriquet of Bloody Mary, spoken in trembling tones behind locked doors and shuttered windows. The vengeance that coloured Mary's earliest policies delivered a harsh lesson to both nobility and commoner alike. When the machinery of state bows entirely to religious fervour, any faction, regardless of its piety, can be turned into an engine of cruelty. Mary believed herself the champion of ancient piety, yet in orchestrating the public punishments of those who had enforced Edward's brutal laws, she only deepened the kingdom's wounds. Fathers who had dutifully carried out Edward's grim mandates found themselves bound to stakes in village greens. Mothers who had prayed in secret saw their children dragged to dank cells for so-called purification. The same flames that consumed foreign priests and Jesuit missionaries also engulfed the innocent scholars, gentlewomen, and peasants caught in the swirling tides of vengeance. In burning the enforcers of her brother's regime, Mary wove a tapestry of retribution so thorough that few escaped its threads unscathed. By the time Mary's fourth autumn approached, her hand had grown heavy with both the pen of decree and the sword of punishment. The very bones of the nation seemed to ache beneath the weight of her reprisals. In the graveyards of London and beyond, simple wooden crosses marked the unmarked graves of those who had dared bend toward reform men of learning, women of gentle faith, and children whose only fault was belonging to the wrong family. Survivors bore in their eyes the quiet sorrow of those who had lost kin and neighbours to these fires of revival. A generation learned to whisper in clipped tones of loyalty, hiding its true beliefs behind curt nods and downcast eyes, for fear that a soft word of dissent might invite the next Inquisition. And so, in the brief span of just 4 years, Mary's reign etched itself as one of the darkest chapters in England's storied history. Her ambitious vow to restore unity through the splendour of Catholic ritual instead hurled the realm back into the arms of factional hatred. The guiding cry of her government, Catholic England Reborn, rang hollow through market towns and manor houses alike, drowned beneath the hush of fear and the clang of armoured boots. The realm, once a tapestry of varied devotion, was rendered into a stark tableau of suspicion, where a whispered prayer risked incineration, and every neighbour could be an informer. The legacy Mary left behind was a stark admonition for posterity when religious authority is wielded without restraint. Even the most earnest convictions may warp into a tyranny that consumes the very souls it claims to save. Soon after Mary's passing, Elizabeth I ascended to the throne and inherited the tangled aftermath of 2 brutally divided reigns. Determined to chart a more temperate course, Elizabeth summoned Parliament in 1559 To enact the Act of Uniformity, this measure established the Church of England's structure, blending Catholic ceremonial elements with services conducted in English. Clergymen were permitted to retain traditional vestments, yet adherence to a revised prayer book was mandated. Under this Elizabethan settlement, Catholic priests could remain in curacy so long as they conformed to the new regulations. This policy of measured compromise, later dubbed the Elizabethan via media, aimed squarely at mending the deep rifts between Protestant zealots and Catholic recusants, forestalling yet another cycle of sectarian bloodshed. Even so, Elizabeth's balanced approach could not erase every trace of hatred. Zealous Puritans, chafing at remnants of papist ritual, plotted quietly against the Queen, dreaming of a wholly reformed commonwealth. At the same time, secretive Catholic circles whispered of restoring the true faith by placing Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, upon England's throne. The realm thus stood on a knife's edge. Fervent reformers schemed in the shadows of cathedral cloisters, while underground Catholic networks conspired in hidden chapels. Although the age of public burnings under Mary was over, Elizabeth's government brooked no tolerance for political intrigue. Acts of treachery, whether motivated by religion or dynastic ambition, were met with swift and severe punishment. Elizabeth empowered a burgeoning intelligence apparatus, led by the astute Sir Francis Walsingham, whose network of spies and codebreakers detected plots before they could bloom. Foreign envoys, intercepted letters, and the coded musings of double agents all fed into this clandestine web. In thwarting schemes to overthrow her, Elizabeth protected both her crown and the fragile peace between warring creeds. Under her watchful eye, the realm settled into a cautious calm. Markets and parish fairs resumed their hum, and the grand festivals of court lent a sense of normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, a pervasive unease lingered. Citizens, mindful of the recent past, spoke of their beliefs in clipped tones and practiced discretion in attending Mass or communion. Families passed down secret prayers and hidden prayer books, fearful that a stray word might invite the ever-present gaze of royal informers. Spiritual life continued, but under a shadow heavier than the iron Baroque gates of London's Newgate prison, Elizabeth's firmness did yield a golden age in other respects. Her reign saw the flowering of English drama and exploration, the establishment of enduring trade routes, and the solidification of a strong central government. The Queen's deft handling of parliamentary factions and foreign alliances allowed her to steer the realm through war threats and financial hardship. Yet even in this prosperous climate, the spectre of religion politics never fully receded. Sermons in midweek pulpits sometimes brimmed with veiled warnings. Itinerant preachers on village greens hinted at conspirators under the cover of night. The memory of past persecutions ensured that the populace remained vigilant, never entirely at ease in professing faith openly. The religious and political upheavals of mid-16th century England cast a long, stubborn shadow over subsequent generations. Though Elizabeth's settlement provided a framework for worship and governance, it also codified divisions that would take centuries to soften. Dissenting voices, whether Puritan or recusant, lived under the constant threat of fines, imprisonment, or exile. Only gradually did notions of religious tolerance and individual conscience emerge, nurtured by slow social change and the dawning idea of inalienable rights. It would take the bloodshed of later revolutions and the philosophic arguments of thinkers in distant lands to dismantle the last vestiges of state-enforced orthodoxy. Thus, Elizabeth's era, her own golden age, remained tinged by the relentless anxiety born of her predecessors' violent experiments. The Queen's compromise forestalled immediate bloodletting, but it also entrenched a caution that wound through families and parishes. In the hush between prayers, in the clandestine verses, tucked into coat pockets, the people of England carried with them the lesson learned from Edward's fanatic harshness and Mary's vengeful fury that when religious conviction merges with unchallenged power, it can corrupt hearts, incite horrors, and leave scars on a nation's soul long after the flames have died. Over time, laws evolved, and the state gradually loosened its grip on conscience. The Toleration Act of 1689 and later reforms chipped away at the barriers erected in Elizabeth's name. But the century of sectarian violence that preceded these changes underscored the fragility of peace founded on coercion. In cottages and courts alike, whispers of the old troubles persisted. A testament to the high cost of wielding faith as a weapon, it was only by embracing the hard-won principle that belief should be free, untethered from the sword and the scaffold, that England could finally set aside its ancient enmities. And so it was that Elizabeth I's settlement, for all its skill and prudence, left an inheritance far more complex than triumph, a reminder that true unity requires not only compromise, but also the freedom to worship in peace, and the courage to protect that freedom against any who might again seek to burn dissent into ashes. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars have turned anew to the reign of Edward VI. Poring over dusty volumes in the royal archives, it was there, among faded seals and crackling parchment, that researchers rediscovered the king's own trembling hand in his private diary and the stark court minutes he signed. These yellowing pages revealed a side of Edward long obscured by legend, not a mere figurehead manipulated by ambitious regents, but a young monarch acutely aware of his divine mandate and zealously committed to purging Catholicism from his realm. His pen, though quivering with fever and fatigue, recorded coldly precise methods of interrogation, meticulous sketches of torture devices, and even a disturbing delight at witnessing sentences carried out. Historians, reading through lines written in uneven script, found repeated references to God's wrath and heretical filth, along with detailed notes on the efficacy of various punishments. One entry describes how Edward measured the flame's height against butcher's hooks, noting which configuration sent the swiftest, most merciful end. Another passage outlines a proposed registry to track every suspected sympathizer, anticipating a kingdom-wide network of informers. Such content has led many modern scholars to dub him the demonic child, a sobriquet reflecting the sheer cruelty that leaps from his own words. These diary pages brought to light an image not of a sheltered boy swayed by elder schemers, but of a driven, unforgiving ruler forging his own path of terror. Psychohistorical studies have mined these same documents for evidence of a disturbed personality. Analysts point to the king's enforced isolation, his strict seclusion from peers, and his regimented, adult-only education as fertile ground for a disordered mind. Lacking the gentle give-and-take of childhood friendship, Edward's emotional development was stunted, replaced by an obsession with power and doctrinal purity. These scholars compare his case with other historical tyrants, noting a troubling parallel: remarkable intellect paired with an utter absence of empathy. Where a healthy mind might recoil at pain inflicted in one's name, Edward's journal entries crescendo into ghoulish satisfaction, as though cruelty itself was a divine right bestowed at birth. Re-examining Edward's brief sovereignty also raises a crucial question for historians: to what extent did tyranny stem from the monarch himself, and how much from the regency apparatus surrounding him? It is indisputable that the council, led first by the Duke of Somerset and later by Northumberland, provided the infrastructure for repression. Yet these long-overlooked personal records show Edward eagerly endorsing, even embellishing, each draconian measure. He did not simply sign decrees at the behest of advisors. He actively shaped them, personally reviewing tribunal reports and adjusting sentences to his precise satisfaction. This active role dismantles any lingering notion of Edward as a passive child king. Instead, it portrays a boy monarch wielding his limited years with calculated ruthlessness. Indeed, the rediscovery of these texts has prompted a subtle shift in historical interpretation. Rather than viewing Edward's reign as a mere interlude of regency politics, many now see it as a window into the young king's own cruel ambitions. Where earlier histories emphasized the regent's missteps, new studies highlight Edward's insistent hand, the pressure he applied to maintain fervour among his tutors, the daily ritual by which he reviewed execution lists, and the way he documented each victim's final screams for future reference. His actions, at once methodical and merciless, reflect an intrinsic drive to mould England into a Protestant stronghold untainted by compromise. Even decades after his death, the shadow of Edward's personal zeal lingers in the archived pages. Students of history, reading his trembling drafts and sealed mandates, confront a chilling portrait of power, harnessed by one too young to temper it with mercy. These revelations do not absolve the Regency Council of responsibility. It was their authority that carried out his orders. But they do insist that Edward VI himself was the architect of much of the terror that unfolded. His legacy, once attributed primarily to the ambitions of Somerset or Northumberland, is now seen as inseparable from the boy, King's own fevered convictions. Thus, the ongoing re-evaluation of Edward VI's short reign stands as a testament to the complexity of historical truth. In the candlelit hush of royal archives, the king's quivering script reminds us that cruelty often springs from the very heart of authority, not merely its supporting cast. While counsels and advisers undoubtedly played roles, it was Edward himself, pen in hand, hope in heart, and flames at ready, who dared to pursue the eradication of Catholicism with singular, devastating purpose. Through his own confessions and commands, he emerges not as a pawn, but as a willful participant in history's darkest page, offering future generations a stark lesson that even a child sovereign can wield divine ambition with lethal force. Edward VI's brief but brutal reign stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when education becomes nothing more than rote doctrine and unchallenged authority is placed in the hands of an unseasoned child. When every decree is justified by divine right, and dissenting voices are silenced, the machinery of governance grinds mercilessly onward, heedless of human cost. In Edward's case, a curriculum steeped purely in theological polemic and monarchical absolutism, coupled with the absence of normal childhood bonds, warped his emerging self into something unrecognizable. The innocent curiosity of youth, channeled only through lectures on God's mandate and the supremacy of his own crown, gave way to a fanaticism that thrived on coercion and fear. More broadly, this tale urges us to reconsider the foundations upon which we build young minds. The greatest peril lies not solely in the concentration of political or religious authority, but in the failure to balance that authority with genuine human connection. When curricula prioritize abstract dogma over empathy, when classrooms lack encouragement for peer interaction, and when emotional nurturing is sacrificed at the altar of intellectual rigor, we risk forging individuals who understand power, but remain strangers to compassion. Edward's story is extreme, a rare historical outlier. Yet it highlights a universal principle. Education, divorced from humanity, yields what one might call a theoretical cuboid. Cold, unfeeling, and dangerously precise in its cruelty. Consider, for a moment, an alternative upbringing, a boy of 9 exposed not only to scripture, but also to the laughter of friends, to the comfort of a mother's solace, to the simple joy of play. Such balanced nurture might have tempered any obsession with absolute rule. Instead, Edward's world consisted of solemn lectures in Latin and Greek, daily reminders of his divinely ordained supremacy, and an entire adult court, treating him as both icon and weapon. The human element's trust, the affection, shared delight in small wonders were systematically stripped away. The result was a ruler who could issue death sentences with the same ease as reciting a prayer, who equated mercy with betrayal, and who measured his success in terms of suffering inflicted rather than well-being achieved. Equally crucial is the lesson about checks on power. No matter how venerable or exalted the office, whether a medieval monarch, a modern president, or the head of any institution, unchecked authority invites abuse. In Edward's case, a single signature spelled doom for countless subjects. His capacity to sanction executions, orchestrate surveillance networks, and conspire in coups revealed the lethal potential of a voice unbalanced by accountability. A system of mutual oversight, regardless of era, serves as the bulwark against such misuse. When advisory bodies, judicial review, and open debate function properly, they dampen the impulse toward unilateral decision-making. But when they fail, as they did under Edward's regency councils and later under his personal command, one individual's ambition can override the common good. Thus, the saga of Edward VI prompts a dual imperative for any society: first, to craft an education that harmonizes intellectual discipline with emotional and social development, and second, to erect robust mechanisms that prevent the concentration of unchecked power. Neither goal is simple. The former demands curricula that value compassion as much as competence, that encourage students to question as well as memorize. The latter requires political and legal structures designed to limit any one person's capacity to command life and death at will. Only by integrating both approaches, humanizing education and institutionalizing restraint, can we hope to avert the creation of rulers who, like Edward, wield divine pretension as justification for unbridled cruelty. In every corner of history, the same warning echoes: power without warmth corrupts, and conviction without balance consumes its wielder along with its victims. Though Edward VI occupied the throne for scarcely 6 fleeting years, the lessons his rule imparts endure with chilling clarity. Vesting absolute authority in the guise of divine sanction corrodes both individual souls and entire communities. His life's arc, from a pampered boy enthroned at 9 to a fledgling tyrant, draws a tragic tableau of power, warped by isolation and unyielding dogma. Neither Mary's retributive purges nor Elizabeth's merciful accommodations could ever fully erase the deep scars he inflicted upon the realm. Today, the echo of Edward's reign serves as a haunting warning. Any institution, be it religious, political, or educational, when twisted to serve narrow ends, can swiftly become an instrument of oppression. When intellect and power intermingle without the tempering balm of empathy, the result is the so-called perfect despot. Even if that figure wears the face of a child, Edward VI stands as an unsparing exemplar, with unchecked authority and a heart unbothered by mercy. A ruler can transform his world into a waking nightmare. Let Edward's tragedy guide every generation first. In education, let us enrich young minds with more than abstract theory. Let us cultivate compassion and social bonds alongside critical thinking. A curriculum that omits the teachings of kindness and mutual respect risks producing leaders who know how to command, but not how to care. Second, in our public and private institutions, we must diversify voices at every level. When decision-making chambers echo only a single perspective, the path to despotism is laid bare. Inclusion of varied experiences and backgrounds thwarts the slide from healthy debate into harsh edict. Above all, we must erect robust mechanisms to check and balance authority. No matter how venerable the office, whether monarch, president, or director, absolute power invites absolute peril. Edward's signature, wielded with fevered conviction, spelled death for thousands. His intricate surveillance networks and hasty coup plots show that a solitary edict can shatter lives. Only by ensuring that multiple bodies oversee governance through transparent procedures, judicial review, and citizen participation, can we prevent the concentration of power that so easily morphs into cruelty. In the hush of history's corridors, Edward's quivering script reminds us that cruelty often finds its birthplace in isolation and in the unchallenged echo of one voice. Yet we need not resign ourselves to that fate. By embedding empathy in education, empowering diverse voices, and building ironclad checks on authority, we can forge societies that resist the siren call of untempered power. In doing so, we honor the memory of a child king whose descent into fanatic tyranny illuminates the dark possibilities inherent in every institution. Let his story be the lantern by which we steer our collective course, preserving our humanity even as we advance our knowledge, encouraging debate even as we require order, and demanding accountability even as we respect authority. Only through such vigilant care can we ensure that righteousness does not become an excuse for violence, and that conscience, not coercion, remains the guiding star of civil life. Although Edward VI's reign lasted a mere 6 years, the lesson he left behind remains indelible, granting absolute authority under the pretense of divine sanction ultimately destroys both individuals and the wider community. From the pampered child elevated to the throne at 9, to the inexperienced boy tyrant who ruled with ruthless fervour, Edward's trajectory paints a tragic portrait of how isolation and rigid dogma can warp human character. Neither Mary's vengeful purges nor Elizabeth's attempts at reconciliation could ever truly erase the deep wounds he inflicted upon the realm. Today, Edward VI's story still resonates as a stark reminder that any system, whether religious, political, or educational, can become an instrument of oppression when misused. When raw intellect and concentrated power go unchecked by empathy, the result is what one might call a perfect despot. Even if that despotic figure wears the face of a child, Edward himself stands as a sobering example, vested with unchallenged authority and completely devoid of mercy. He turned his kingdom into a waking nightmare. Let Edward's tragic reign guide future generations first. In education, we must enrich young minds with more than rote doctrine, cultivating kindness, emotional intelligence, and social bonds alongside critical thinking. A curriculum that omits the teachings of compassion and respect risks producing leaders who know how to wield power but lack the capacity to care. Second, in our institutions, public or private, we must amplify diverse perspectives at every level. When decision-making chambers echo only a single voice, the path to despotism becomes all too clear. By including a wide range of backgrounds and viewpoints, we thwart the slide from healthy debate into harsh decree. Above all, robust checks and balances are non-negotiable. No office, be it king, president, or CEO, should operate without oversight. Edward's single signature spelled death for thousands. His surveillance networks crushed dissent, and his coup plots threatened the very fabric of governance. Only by ensuring transparent procedures, judicial review, and active citizen engagement can we prevent the concentration of power that so easily morphs into cruelty. In the hush of history's archives, Edward's trembling script reminds us that cruelty often sprouts where voices go unchallenged. Yet we need not resign ourselves to that fate. By embedding empathy in education, embracing diverse voices, and institutionalizing restraint, we can forge societies resilient to the lure of unchecked authority. In so doing, we honor the memory of a boy king whose descent into fanatic tyranny illuminates the critical importance of balancing power with compassion.